I'm a Looking for Lilith company associate. My day job is as a news producer for WFPL. And how's it going?
Jeff Blanchard. I grew up in Louisville, but I now live in Chicago, and I'm a designer by trade. And over the last handful of years, I've started doing more artistic work that often involves photographing people, and it's a personal attempt to just explore identity and sexuality and gender and the overlap.
I'm Mari Mujica, and I now live in Kentucky, but I grew up in Peru. I'm an anthropologist by trade and a photographer, and lately I have been doing photo ethnographies, which include portraits and testimonies from people. So I also explore different issues.
Okay, perfect. So we heard a lot about the male gaze in this play. So I kind of wanted to go back to the beginning and figure out what we mean by that when we say that phrase. The male gaze is a theory that was first talked about by Laura Mulvey in 1975, and it was used as a way to analyze film. And the idea is that in film, women are typically the objects rather than the possessor. And they called it the male gaze because the assumption was that the typical default audience member is a heterosexual male, or that the typical filmmaker at that time was a straight male. So that's kind of what we mean by that. And so I wanted to first start out by talking to you both about the use of nudity in your own photography. Kind of what is your relationship to that? Have you used it? And what does it evoke in a photograph? What do you get from a portrait if you use nudity as opposed to what you can evoke in that photograph without it, if that makes sense?
I actually really have not used, I have not done any photography that includes full nudity.
Well, I know that in some of your work that I've seen, like you did a portrait series of transgender people.
Oh,
well, it wasn't full nudity.
Yes, you're right.
It was like.
Remember that? I mean, it's not like yeah.
But it's like a close up, and I wanted to be able to show pictures tonight, but we couldn't get the projector thing to work. It's like close ups of uncovered parts. Like it looks like maybe a hip or a shoulder or something.
Right. Actually, what I was working on this project that I call Transgender Lives, Transgender Images, and the other photographer that was working with me focused a lot in his portraits were address the transition. So, and he had mostly photographs of trans women with pictures of them when they were boys or men. And I because of my approach was, I was very aware of how that could just continue the stereotyping of trans people. You know, like the first, and this was actually about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So it was a lot earlier than you know. Right now we are. This is part of the discourse much more often, and so and part of it actually, one of the reasons I stopped doing anthropology, which I was doing in Peru, was because I felt that I really, if I engage in any research, or it had to be a collaboration where it's not that I go extract the information and come back here. And so in doing this, in working on this project, it was very important to me to engage the transgender community. And there was this concern about being out as a trans person, and it's a lot I found that it was a lot harder for trans men to be out. It's like once you become a trans man, you could go under the radar screen a lot easier at one level, and then at another level, the very personal decision of being out or not. And so I wanted to do two things. I wanted to show how the body that we are paying so much attention to, and that it is so important. At the same time, like the body that I photographed could be a woman or could be a man. And in fact, it's a trans man who didn't want his identity to be shared. So I actually have had photographs of his mastectomy, and but he wasn't ready to share that. So I respected that. So that was one of the photographs that I chose, and then the other body parts were just creating this, trying intentionally to create some awareness about what does this all mean, and how there is this whole range of trans identity that people don't know anything about, and it's just a body, and at the same time it's so important because it's the body that you live in. But so that's why I used. I didn't think of it. I was thinking of nudity more as a project, as a long-term project.
Right.
So
that makes sense, yeah.
Thanks for reminding me. So
You're very
glad to share.
Well, my photography is, on the one hand, just an attempt to create something beautiful and something celebrating the human form, but also it's a reflection on some of my own identity and changes over the years in how I perceive myself and other people. And a lot of people I photograph are close to me, and they're people who are not heteronormative, or they may be transgendered or differently bodied. And not all of the images I take are nudes necessarily, but there is an attempt to appreciate what's distinctive about each person and how they use their body as a medium for expressing themselves and who they are as individuals. And so I have a friend who's a burlesque dancer, and she feels that her body is her art form. It's her medium for sharing herself and sharing the beauty she has. She's also queer, so she has very great representation of both masculine and feminine traits, which is really interesting to see that overlap in a person. And so when there's a nude, there's this opportunity it is a vulnerability to share that. And so there's and you explored some of that tonight, this tension of, do I want to reveal this about myself? Is it worthwhile, or what's the end result going to be? But in that exploration and in that that relationship that's formed in that period, there's a conversation happening, and it can be very liberating and very beautiful to see a person shed whatever. It's just a lot to. But the way we dress is.
It's all drag of some kind.
It's all drag of some kind. Yeah.
That's what RuPaul's great quote was, like, we're all born naked and the rest is all drag.
Right. It's a great statement. And the way we dress day in and day out is just it's how we have to conform in certain ways to do what we have to do in our lives. And when we don't have to have that restriction, beautiful things can happen.
Well, I'm glad that we have Trina and Sean here, because I think that one of the most apropos scenes in the play to what we're talking about tonight is after the artist reception, when you all kind of have your back and forth, and Joyce's character raises a lot of very valid questions. One of the biggest laughs that I had when I saw the play the first time was when she said, like, do you jerk off to them? Like, and he's like, well, what if I do? Does that make me a sleazeball? So I guess my question for you both and for all of you too is, does that matter? And I think in asking that question, what we're asking is, does the motive of the photographer matter? Does it change the meaning of the image? You know, because a lot of times I think the viewer, the audience, the eventual audience will not know.
Right.
Might not know anything about the photographer, might not know that much about the subject and their motivations for posing and the photographer's motivations for taking that picture. Does it matter that he's a man who's attracted to women doing this? You know what I mean? Like, I'd love to hear your take on that and for you all to chime in with your thoughts on how much that matters or not.
Maybe we could start with the least qualified. Get that out of the way.
Are you volunteering yourself? Is that?
I mean, yeah. I mean, just because my personal take is allowing the fact that we don't always know the artist or what his intentions are. But having to say that line on the other side, saying that it didn't matter, I have to think that if we are aware that they're creepy or whatever, then I think that it does. It says that the art shouldn't be about the intentions of the artist. It should be about the effect the art has on the audience. Well, I think that if you're able to gauge the intentions of the artist, I think it would be absurd not to add that into the equation. It would be a known quantity. It would be a known factor, and it would have to go into at least a personal consideration. Now, whether that consideration is valid for the next person, I think would be up to the individual. Maybe someone wouldn't care if that person masturbates to that picture. But I think to say that you can't consider that a valid option, and if you do, you're somehow violating some art theory is narrow-minded. But that's my take.
Well, the thing, I mean, you sent me the link, and I was trying to prepare myself to this, and I was thinking of a couple of things. One is the objectification of women and women's bodies that is a part of what we deal with every day. I mean, advertising and everything. And I actually looked up some photographers that were doing nudes of women mostly, and it's very interesting how the majority that came up were male. And I did notice a more than subtle difference in the one photographer that I found who was a woman. And I think the best example I can give is the images that we see a lot, especially in advertising, and which inform the discourse of what was her name in the play?
Ellis.
Ellis. That there is this utilization, and it is the images for the male gaze. I mean, and there is a lot. Some of you have seen the films by what's this woman who talks about advertising in terms of killing us softly. But it's women that are almost like looking like, come rape me, which we know it's not a whim. It's really. The culture is telling us so much that this is what women are about, because it's a very male culture, it's a patriarchal culture. And so having said that, I think actually what is important is not the individual only intention and also the relationship with the art piece that the public has, but what's the context in which this happens, I think is very important to consider. And also, and I think that's what I found fantastic in the play, that you can see where everybody's bringing in their own story and their own experiences of oppression and of liberation. And some, like Phyllis, get stuck into this mental concept which becomes a barrier for her to really open herself as a human being. And I think, and to me, I really enjoy seeing how it all comes together in the play, and it's the power of art. You know, I think anybody that is really, I mean, that's what art does. It just creates so many more opportunities to transcend the culture. And I actually talk a little bit about that in my photo ethnography. One of the things, you know, when people are looking at these women in their eyes, and the women are talking about, or, you know, writing or saying what's important to them, then, you know, you realize, you know, it doesn't matter if she's an immigrant, documented where she's from. It's like, I as a woman can relate to that, or you as a man can relate to that, in any woman that you know. So I think that the play does that. It demonstrates the power of art to transcend so much.
Trina.
I'll interject some things.
Sure.
As far as art is concerned, with me personally, I'd like to appreciate the artist, but we have ancient art that we have no idea who the artist was, and we only have what's left to appreciate. So me personally, although I'd like to appreciate the artist, it does not matter to me who that artist was and what their motive was. It is the final project and the final visual, whatever it is. As far as the male gaze or a male glancing at things, I think we see it in fashion that women do not dress for men, they dress for women. You can go to, I own a bridal shop. Yes, the bride is dressing for her male love, but the bridesmaids are not. They're all competing with each other. They're competing for the women in the guest. They are not wearing their bridesmaids' dresses for men. So I think we need to kind of look and see, are women dressing for men, or are they dressing for women? And it has nothing to do with sexuality, but there's a lot of women that carry really expensive handbags that most men have no idea what they are. They are carrying it to impress other women.
It's more like a status thing than
it's
a
a status
sexuality
thing. And so I think everything about photography and the old movies and everything was about the men. Maybe that's changed, because I think it's women trying to impress other women. To compete for the men in the room if they're the heterosexual women. But they are not dressing for the men, for the most part.
Well, that's interesting, because I feel like the character Frank would probably say something similar, because he said in the play, like, all that matters is, do you like the image? Do you find it powerful? Do you find it beautiful? He was very clearly on the side of, it doesn't matter what the artist was thinking. It matters how you respond to the image. Trina, I know you wanted to jump in.
Well, my thought was that I think about, it's maybe easier in theater, but I think about how really effective art, for me, often the intention is clear in the artwork. Like hopefully the way the artist has created it, I get a feeling that they intended me to get.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and
Hopefully,
not
yes.
everyone's going to react the same, of course, but I think about how we've sometimes used, and other colleagues we've worked with have used Liz Lerman's critical response process, which is a process you use to respond to art. It was started with dance, but it can be used with visual art, any art. And one of the parts of this process is very artist-focused, is you ask the artist questions. Rather than giving feedback on what you thought of the art, you ask them questions, and often those questions end up being about their intention. Like, you know, your choice of the red dress in that third scene, what was your intention in putting the actor in that red dress? As opposed to saying, oh, I hated that red dress, because they might say, I wanted you to hate it. I wanted you to have this, like, visceral reaction. Oh, well, that's exactly what they wanted, okay?
Yeah.
So part of that critical response process in a work in progress is to say, what did you intend, and did it work the way you intended? Because if it didn't, maybe you go back and you revise that work of art. So the idea that
Right.
and I think in theater especially, more typical, very verbal theater as opposed to silent theater or something, we use words so much. It's much easier to be literal and to make sure the message that the artist is intending is very clear to the audience. And I don't know as much about visual art and how that translates in just the piece of art. I know for me, when I see visual art, I love to see the title. That's part of the verbal that helps kind of frame the visual art for me. If there's an artist statement, I love to see that, because that feeds into it for me. And then in specifically the Century Project by Frank Cordell that his character's based on, in that book, almost all the photos on the other page is a statement by the woman about why she wanted to have that photo done, which is really powerful for me, because the pictures, for example, that were of younger women or pictures where the woman looked more sexualized, when I was reading, well, I am a stripper, and that's part of my power, and I wanted to take this very sexy picture as part of my power. Or a young girl who was like, well, I had been through this, or I had seen my mom go through this, and so why? And he had some pictures of women at like 6, and then again at 17. And then eventually when they were older, and their own daughter. Because it spanned so many years that you got to see a couple of women at different ages. So hearing them talk about why they wanted to do it, it kind of made the artwork, the whole Century Project was photography, and there was a literary aspect to the art also, because even though they weren't thinking I'm writing literary art, they were writing their statement.
Right.
And that really reflected, having that right beside, just black words on white paper of what they intended, what the woman intended in reclaiming her self-image.
Right, what the woman.
By having this session with him. So she was part of the creator of this art, because she was doing what she intended. And one of the big things is he wouldn't tell women how to pose. I mean, if they were frozen, he might give them some stuff, but often he'd be like, I didn't say anything. This young woman, that's what she wanted to do.
Yeah.
You know, this is, so it depends on the artist. I mean, it's one thing if someone's taking these photographs, telling you exactly what to do, or as in the case of the recent fashion photographer, sexually harassing the women and,
Right,
trying to take advantage. So for me, it does matter, but I would hope that in the strongest art, I wouldn't need to know to experience it by seeing the art. That hopefully it would be in the final product, and if it felt like it needed contextualization, an awesome
there's
title
big
or
difference.
artist statement can give that for me. Because
Yeah.
sometimes you can be like, ooh, people can take this either way. So five-word titles, sometimes it's like, oh, okay, that helps give me a little
Gives you a
literary
clue,
art
at least,
to
right.
frame
There being
it for
the
me,
big
right?
difference between
You know.
what Frank Cordell's Century Project and the type of commercial photography.
Right,
that
which
you're-
serves a different purpose.
That is
Yeah.
considered
So then
art, I
you're
suppose,
getting
but
into-
Not
very
always.
different. Yeah.
You're getting into the intentions of the subject, not just the photographer.
Which was what his work was.
Which is
yeah.
something else I wanted to bring up, because the character of Joyce, she says, I want to make sure I'm doing this for the right reasons.
not sure what her intentions
Like, I'm
even
curious
are.
about what it would be like to pose, but I want to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons. So I would ask all of you, are there wrong reasons? What are good reasons and what are not good reasons? Have you ever had a model that you felt was maybe doing it for questionable reasons? And what would that look like?
Well, I've shot people who are more on the professional side of modeling. They model for a living, not for a living necessarily all the time, but they do figure.
Professional print work. Yeah.
And just to go back to what's being presented, photography is almost necessarily representative. So the question can be, well, what is this representing? Well, if it's a photo of a landscape or of a building, then you have a more kind of passive object, which can be seen how it's seen. But in the case of shooting an actual person who has their own intentions, their own motivations, hopefully there's a conversation happening there, and the subject is bringing their own intentions and their own expressions to that moment, and that not only is the photographer's intentions being represented, but the subject's also. And it's what was the last thing you asked?
The model's reasons and whether they're good or bad reasons.
So a lot of people may not know exactly what they want to present in themselves, but they know that they want to present something good and something which other people want to receive. And we all want to be accepted by each other as human beings. We have that commonality, and we just express it in different ways. So sometimes the act of participating in a sitting for a photo, that emerges just in the course of that dialogue.
So it's a more collaborative piece of work than it would be to shoot a landscape or something.
And so I think to me the question, that's where the question of the male gaze will come in. I don't see that collaboration, but then, you know, I think some artists will claim that this is just art and this is what I do. And, you know, I think one thing that and I think the concept of, when he talks about dictionary, he's brilliant. Prescriptive and descriptive is just a very powerful, because we do that with art, I think, or about art in our conversations. But I couldn't help, especially at the beginning, like, you know, this very egotistic personality that you show, like, you know, the kind of like this very schematic view of an artist, you know, like those say, I'm just pure artist, you know, I don't know. And I think what this conversation, we are talking about a more committed art. I mean, I know that even, you know, I am a social justice activist, and so I am also a cultural organizer, and so I do art for that. But even when I'm not, I mean, even when I'm, you know, I've been working on these photographs, I call it the repurposed ingredients, and it's really photographs of food before it goes in the compost. And to me, just that the relationship with how people were looking, you know, what people were seeing, just fascinated me, because there were so many different responses. And yes, I mean, I was bringing awareness of, that's one of the things that I have to do, to find the beauty in places where other people don't find it. You know, that's part of my vision, my mission as an artist. But it's not that I look for that mission, it's just that it comes to me naturally. And so I want to share that. And so it was very interesting to see the different interpretations of, you know, this is what I see there. Oh, this is what I see. So it was fun, yeah. But I think we need to be aware that there is that kind of essentialist definition of what an artist is. And then if you start looking at that, you start seeing, you know, why is art, I mean, you know, it's like the concept of high art or art in the streets. And I think in Louisville, we're very lucky. We have a lot of popular art, and, but we're still fighting. I mean, the funding is going to this, I mean, you know, looking for Lilith. You know, we have to work and do our own fundraising, and so we're still fighting against that. And I think that, you know, why art is the first thing to go in the schools when there is a tight budget. It's just so short-sighted.
Yes. Do you all have any questions for our panel or for each other?
Hey, the director is here.
The director joined us. What do you all think it means that he doesn't photograph men? Is that problematic? I mean, is that necessarily problematic?
It's not, well,
No, I don't find it any problematic at all.
for that artist, no, because that's not his intent.
That's not what the mission is.
But clearly it was a sticking point for Phyllis.
It would be for me, because I think one of the benefits, or one of the great outcomes of feminism, is that it has allowed us to try to remove some of that distinction. There doesn't have to be this polarity or this binary that we prescribe to one or the other. We can there's much middle ground, and there's a lot of opportunity to explore that middle ground. And so I find the male form beautiful also, and I think in the classical age that was, you know, more present. Often today, because the female form is so exploited in a lot of ways for commercial reasons, the male form is, if it's presented at all, it's often sexualized, and it's not seen as a beautiful thing, and that's kind of sad. I think that.
Well, you know, I was also thinking this afternoon of how, you know, in looking at when I haven't seen the exhibit at Popol, it is, but on how the female body has been exploited and continues, is like re-exploited. And you see any film that shows some nudity, and one nudity is shown. It's just like it's it's almost stereotypical. But I was thinking of the experience that that Georgia O'Keeffe had when what's his name? Stricker? His Streichen.
Yeah.
So he was a photographer, and he did beautiful pictures of her, of nudes of her. Beautiful. I mean, they're really works of art. And he was kind of, at that point, and I know this just learning about Georgia O'Keeffe, but one of the things that happened, she was very young, he was older, he was an established artist, she had been a school teacher, and what happened was her whole art of flowers, where she's really almost like a botanist, and she explains how frustrating it was and for how long she didn't show those pictures, because those images were totally sexualized. They were interpreted as these are women's body parts in flowers.
And she didn't like that?
No, because that wasn't her intention. I mean, there is a sensuality in those, but I think it was a response to this whole artist community of critics that had seen, and for years, apparently, she never, I learned this because I saw this retrospective, and it was amazing. So that's one case, and then the other case is Frida Kahlo, and how there's been so many studies about her, and this idea that she just painted her illness. And my impression, actually, I developed like a little act on her, and I have to get training from looking for Lilith. My impression is that it's like she was so invisible because of Diego Rivera. He was the famous artist, and she's just there in bed painting herself, looking at herself in the mirror. But also she's telling the world, I'm here, and this is who I am. And, but she was totally misinterpreted as this, I think there's a lot of, so anyways.
I mean, that raises a great question for you both as artists. If your work is being completely misinterpreted, or you feel like it's being displayed for an audience that is completely not getting it, or getting it in a creepy or unintended way, how would you respond to that? I mean, and then it's the opposite end of how much does the artist's intention matter? How much does the audience reception matter to the meaning of that art?
Well, I think that the key is that it's a process. I mean, for me as an artist, and what I teach in the workshops on creativity that I do is, I think the most blocking thing is to try to do something for someone else. It's like being in the world. If you are there to please everyone, if you're not making somebody mad, you're really not making any change in the world. So, but I think as an artist, I don't know what you have to say, but I think the main thing is to remain, is the process of doing it, right? And then if it's well received, but I don't know, I'm not that famous, or I haven't made any money out of my art, but I don't know what will happen in that situation, but I think ultimately the most important is the process that really transforms you in doing it, right?
Yeah, the creative process is vital. That's a big part of why we're here, and not everything we create is going to be well received, but by contributing it and hoping that bit by bit people do receive it and they see the good in it, then and just like this play, it might be offensive or challenging to some people, but the fact that it exists makes them consider those things, and so they can come back to it with a fresh mind, maybe a later time, and say, there's some value there. Let's explore that further. So it's important.
All right. Well, unless anybody has any more questions, I would like to thank you both for being with us, and thank you all for staying to talk.
Thank you so much.